Ronald Lamola has recently revealed that out of 3,697 criminal cases of child neglect and abuse against parents or caregivers, only 35 people have been imprisoned countrywide from January 2012 to October 2022. The minister was responding to questions in Parliament which focused on the conviction rate, dismissals or acquittals as a result of poor investigations, the number of cases which had been withdrawn and suspects awaiting trial and sentencing. Well, let's get reaction from Director at Molosongololo, Patrick Solomon. Thank you so much, Patrick, for joining us this morning. That figure that was released by the Justice Minister, Ronald Lamola, 3,467 cases since January 2012. What are your thoughts on that? At the risk of sounding morbid, it does seem that that figure is a little too low.
Well, yes, we've been very shocked at this news of only 3,697 cases over a 10-year period. So we're very, very concerned. And so it indicates that many cases don't really get to the prosecutorial process and to that stage. And then very few of them are successful prosecutions. And so that is quite shocking for us to get this kind of result. Because from where we are working on the ground with cases, with children, with families in the communities, the picture looks a bit different. And also the picture looks very much different than with the data that the Department of Social Development collects. Social workers have to report all cases of child abuse and child neglect. It's a national database where they can collect all the cases. It basically means that only a fraction of cases gets then identified for charges and then get identified to be investigated and then prosecuted. It is a very, very disturbing picture that is being presented by them. So we are very, very concerned. And I think one of the things that most likely Molosongololo will be doing is that we will engage the minister and also our partners within social development, within the health department, and also other NGOs. We need to look at this situation that we have. Because we do know that there are many barriers that people encounter, that children and families encounter when they want to report cases. So that's the first point of where children can begin to seek justice. Even more difficult for our children when the very people supposed to protect them are their abusers, like parents and caregivers. So children ordinarily need other people to support them. Be a friend, could be a neighbor, could be another family member that help them in the reporting of these crimes against them, or it could be a social worker, the police, whatever it might be. So there's a massive gap between the reporting, because the numbers that the police release in terms of the number of cases that get reported to them and the numbers that the minister released is too vast different. Big gap between these numbers. So it is very shocking for us, and I'm sure that many people will be very, very concerned about exactly what the minister is doing. He is not also reporting effectively on the nature of the cases. That's also very important. It's also not reporting very effectively on the reasons why certain cases are dropped, for example, and also not reporting effectively in terms of the number of unsuccessful cases that has been prosecuted, but there was not a judgment against the offenders. That is also very important, because we need to understand where the challenges lie. Is it within the justice system itself? Is it within the investigation process? And also, you must remember that our system relies on what they refer to as a reliable witness. Often children, when something bad happens to them, they are in a state of trauma, as well as this continuous threat and pressure, because it is their parents, it is caregivers that they have to give evidence against, right? And often there's challenges that we experience there. Many children don't have support of social workers and of organizations can support them and support the family. So there are many barriers that we experience, but I think it would be good to hear from the minister what are these kind of barriers that the National Prosecuting Authority are experiencing. Is it the investigation phase? Is it within the prosecutorial phase? Where are we experiencing challenge? Because these numbers are unacceptable.
Indeed.
We do know that far too many children are being abused and neglected by the very people who are supposed to protect them.
Indeed. Outside of the shocking sort of figures that we have here from the Minister, denoting a lack of reporting from your perspective, the other shocking incident here is the fact that just about 70% of these cases are actually withdrawn, and they're never withdrawn by the victim, which is often a minor. And so that, that leads to the question, why are these cases being withdrawn? Is it a case of, the National Prosecuting Authority declining to prosecute, declining to move forward with the case? Or is it a case where, either the parent or the guardian of the victim is coming forward to say that they would much rather deal with the issue of neglect or abuse as a family rather than taking it through the criminal justice system? In your experience, when cases like these are withdrawn, what are often the factors in play?
There are many. One of the things that we experience is, of course, that the case is poorly prepared. From the very beginning, there's very poor statements taken. So there's a problem with the statement-taking process that we experience. Then, of course, there's a problem with the actual investigation. Sometimes we find that many of the investigators, they have many cases that they have to deal with. So there's a lack of resource with regard to that. Other times we also see that because there's not enough transport, there's not enough communication resources made available, but often investigators are unable to communicate with the victims, inform them and brief them. Sometimes a case have to is open at court, and victims are expected to be at court, but they don't meet up. So we experience many difficulties at that level. We also often have that sometimes the prosecutors are very poorly prepared when they go into court. That often they only see the case file that morning when they step into court, and that is a big challenge that we have. There's been some efforts in various districts, for example, for better cooperation, and the Family Violence and Child Protection Unit has been doing lots of great work at that level. But what we experience on the investigation part is a lack of resources. It's a big challenge. And then, of course, also the important, because the Child Protection Unit, they do not take statements. Most of them do not take statements unless there's a need or an urgency or it's a priority case.
Yeah.
It is the only police person at the police station that will take a statement, and they're often not properly trained and don't apply the kind of sensitivity to these kinds of cases where that statement have to be taken.
Yeah.
If that statement is poor and weak and it's been compromised, you will have a case that gets thrown out of court.
Yeah.
So these are the kind of things that the minister, with his counterparts in the police and within the social development sector and the health sector, they have to work together. Because we've seen, for example, the backlog with regard to the rape kits, right? We still have the backlog around rape kits. And so we are not going to see effective prosecutions if we don't clean that up. So the minister has to report a bit more clearly about exactly what the barriers are, and he must report this to his counterparts, the police and the social development.
Yeah.
And together they have to address these challenges, because it's unacceptable that we have only 3,697 cases over a 10-year period that has been in the prosecutorial process.
Yeah.
And a fraction of those have been successful prosecutions.
Yeah. Well, Patrick, we've dealt with, some of the gaps and the fault lines that are very clearly present when it comes to the criminal justice system. But I want to talk about child neglect and abuse as a nefarious form of abuse that happens, in a domestic setting, in an environment where children are supposed to feel most safe. And, oftentimes we see the child line number being populated on our TV screens, populated on our radio stations. There is a public campaign to have children who are being abused to come forward with these allegations and claims. But often they don't, you know, and it's understandable. They are the victims. They are the vulnerable individuals in this position. Talk to us about the dynamics that are often at play in cases of child neglect, child abuse, that can often lead to the sort of lack of reporting that we're seeing, and perhaps even the withdrawal of some of these cases.
Well, it's very difficult and very complex. Of course, we work with mainly the poor, the very poor. So poverty-related conditions is one of the big challenges that we experience, because that gives rise to a whole range of sort of factors, and also fuel things like a lot of family pressure, economic pressure, and then of course you have situations where people act out, in an abusive way, begin to, reflect a lot of those things onto their children. So abuse and neglect often. We see that play out within the family environment. Often very difficult to reach into the family home. So when we do home visits, for example, what we do see is that alcohol and substance abuse is a big problem. Many of our children, they live with adults, their parents, and a large number of them live with only the mother, and then there's a lot of other adults in the house, and many of them are not family members, right? And so the issue of care and supervision and support for the children is often quite lacking. Children often put pressure on the parents because they need food and other basic stuff. And often when parents are unable to provide these things, parents, eat out at their children, scream and shout at them, push them, shove them, and even beat them into silence. So that is what we do see. We also see, for example, that many of the adults are either partners of the parents, for example. They also we see a lot of that kind of cases where they are being abused and mistreated, verbal abuse, physical abuse. We see that kind of stuff happening. And the difficulty for children is that these are the people in positions of power. So it's very difficult for them to report against those people, their parents, their caregivers. And it's often, in most cases, we find always someone else that alerts us, or we begin to see physical signs of neglect or abuse. And recently, for example, we have seen a lot of indicators of malnutrition within children. They are not eating, they're not getting a meal every day. So that is a big concern for us. Children themselves report that their parents are using the money that they have and spend it on alcohol and other things and not food.
Right.
So parenting issues, lack of parental support is a challenge. And then, of course, also with the older children, we find that the neglect and abuse often turn into violence against the children, and many of them get thrown out of the house. And many of the children do not report.
Right.
Patrick, you ask them.
Unfortunately, we are going to have to leave our conversation there, but thank you so much for coming onto the program and sharing your insights with us.